Frank McCourt's memoir, Angela's Ashes, poverty is not merely a backdrop. It serves as a central force in shaping the narrative. The book explores McCourt's childhood in Limerick, Ireland, during the 1930s and 1940s, offering a raw portrayal of hardship, often blending fact with embellishment, and revealing the psychological and emotional toll of extreme poverty. Through vivid imagery of hunger, disease, and humiliation, McCourt provides a complex view of the ways poverty can shape identity and survival. This essay examines how poverty is depicted in Angela's Ashes through its emotional consequences, its cyclical nature, and its impact on McCourt's resilience. Physical deprivation is a recurring theme in Angela's Ashes, where the McCourt family's poverty is illustrated with shocking detail. Basic necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, are consistently out of reach, and McCourt's accounts of hunger, malnutrition, and illness underscore the dire conditions. Meals are scarce, often reduced to bread and tea, and hunger becomes a constant presence in their lives. However, some of McCourt's descriptions may be exaggerated, as certain aspects of his portrayal of Limerick's impoverished conditions have been called into question by critics. The family's living conditions are grim. McCourt describes a cold, damp, and decaying home, but the extent of these conditions has been debated. While it is likely that the McCourts lived in challenging circumstances, some of McCourt's depictions may have been amplified to reinforce the narrative of deprivation. Health is also severely impacted, with McCourt recounting the deaths of his siblings, including one from malnutrition. While these tragic events occurred, some critics argue that the frequency and causes of illness in the book may be overstated. Poverty in Angela's Ashes also takes a significant psychological and emotional toll on the McCourt family. Frank, especially, feels the weight of shame and humiliation, exacerbated by the family's visible poverty and the societal judgment that follows. Torn clothes, hand-me-down shoes, and constant reminders of their status make Frank painfully aware of his social position. However, some of the humiliation portrayed might be embellished for dramatic effect, as McCourt's experience of stigma may not have been as pervasive as he suggests. The family's dependence on charity reinforces their feelings of powerlessness. McCourt often reflects on the discomfort of receiving assistance from organizations like St. Vincent Delaware Paul. While charity undoubtedly brings relief, McCourt portrays it as a reminder of their inability to escape poverty. Yet, these moments of charity might be exaggerated, as not all poverty-stricken families may have felt the same bitterness toward charity. Frank's relationship with his father, Malachi, is fraught with resentment, especially due to Malachi's alcoholism. His father's irresponsibility further exacerbates their financial instability, but the portrayal of Malachi's behavior is seen by some as more dramatic than the reality. The tension between Frank's dreams of escape and his grim circumstances illustrates the emotional weight of poverty, but it's important to note that some aspects of McCourt's portrayal might be colored by his personal bitterness. McCourt emphasizes the cyclical nature of poverty, showing how it is passed down from generation to generation. His father, Malachi, is depicted as a product of systemic neglect, unable to escape his own poverty. This cycle is perpetuated by his failure to provide for his family and McCourt's early work experiences, delivering coal or shining shoes, reinforce the idea that his prospects are limited. However, critics have questioned the extent to which McCourt's family was trapped in a cycle of poverty, suggesting that opportunities may have been more available than McCourt portrays. Even Frank's mother, Angela, faces significant barriers to escape. While Angela is portrayed as hardworking and determined, her ability to break free from poverty is constrained by both her husband's behavior and the societal limitations placed on her. While her resilience is admirable, the systemic forces that restrict her options may not be as absolute as McCourt suggests. Despite the overwhelming adversity McCourt faces, Angela's Ashes is not devoid of moments of resilience and hope. McCourt frequently uses dark humor as a coping mechanism, a way to shield himself from the harshness of his reality. This humor provides a brief respite from despair, even though its frequency and function in McCourt's narrative are sometimes overstated. The memoir is also about escape, particularly Frank's eventual departure for America, which symbolizes the possibility of breaking free from the cycle of poverty. However, McCourt's escape is not a complete triumph. Even as Frank moves toward a better life, the scars of his past remain, illustrating that breaking free from poverty is not a clean break. Some may question the romanticism of his eventual escape, as the difficulties Frank faces in America may have been more complex than McCourt implies. In Angela's Ashes, Frank McCourt provides an often grim, sometimes exaggerated, depiction of poverty and its effects on his life. Through his descriptions of deprivation, shame, and the cyclical nature of poverty, McCourt paints a powerful picture of how systemic forces trap individuals in poverty. Yet, even amid these hardships, McCourt highlights moments of resilience, humor, and hope. The memoir's ultimate message is one of survival and determination, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. However, it is important to remember that McCourt's portrayal of poverty, while deeply impactful, contains a mix of factual elements and fictionalized accounts, which may have been shaped by his personal experiences and narrative choices.
In discussing the portrayal of poverty, especially as it's depicted in the lives of the family in Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, there are multiple exaggerated and harrowing accounts of deprivation. The hardships of growing up in Limerick in the mid-20th century are presented with a raw, almost grim humor that at times stretches the concept of poverty to its most extreme edges. Each of the points raised about their family's suffering reflects both the very real, visceral nature of poverty but also the exaggerated ways in which this suffering is framed to evoke a sense of hopelessness, deprivation, and social neglect. These exaggerations, in many ways, emphasize the degradation of dignity and self-worth, offering a window into the stark realities faced by a family struggling to survive in an unforgiving environment.
The first exaggeration lies in the depiction of Limerick as a perpetually rainy and damp place. This image is repeated throughout the narrative, reinforcing the idea of a place that mirrors the emotional and physical coldness the family endures. Limerick, particularly in the context of the 1930s and 1940s, was certainly no stranger to rain, but McCourt's portrayal often makes it seem like a city drenched in an unrelenting downpour, further symbolizing the family's misery. This atmospheric exaggeration heightens the sense of suffocating despair, with rain constantly associated with their hardships. The rain becomes more than just a weather pattern, it transforms into a metaphor for their poverty and lack of escape, never allowing them to dry out or find respite. In a city where the dampness is almost constant, the family's inability to find warmth, both physical and emotional, seems inexorable.
Another frequent exaggeration in the text is the depiction of rats. While it's true that poor living conditions often lead to infestations of pests, the constant descriptions of rats infesting the McCourt family's home are meant to evoke a sense of horror and filthiness. This recurring image reflects how the family's poverty is not only about material deprivation but also a deeper, almost animalistic existence. The rats symbolize both the physical decay of the house, a structure that's supposed to offer safety and comfort, and the sense of degradation the family feels. They become an external manifestation of their internalized suffering. The rats represent the dehumanizing aspects of poverty, highlighting that the family is living in conditions so dire that even the most basic needs for sanitation and hygiene are denied.
McCourt frequently exaggerates the condition of their house by claiming that it was in worse shape than typical tenements of the time. This depiction plays into the idea that the family's situation is far beyond the ordinary or acceptable, further distancing them from any hope of a better life. While the house might have been in disrepair, McCourt's portrayal makes it appear as though it was in a state of utter collapse, perhaps even more dilapidated than the typical tenement housing that would have existed in poor urban areas at the time. This exaggeration is not just a commentary on their lack of material wealth, but a way to visually represent their total abandonment by society. The house becomes a physical manifestation of the family's social isolation, reflecting how the family's very existence is subsumed into a state of neglect.
One of the most striking exaggerations in McCourt's depiction of the family's poverty is the claim that they lived without basic furniture for years. While it is possible that the McCourts were unable to afford luxury items, the idea that they went without something as essential as chairs, tables, or even a bed for a long period seems almost too extreme. This detail serves to emphasize the brutality of their poverty, stripping them of basic comforts that most people take for granted. The lack of furniture in the home highlights their inability to create a space of normalcy or comfort, further isolating them from the rest of society. This lack of material goods also has emotional weight, reinforcing the idea that the family's needs are never met and that their very survival is always in question.
McCourt also exaggerates the lack of proper clothing for the children, especially in the cold winter months. While it is likely that the family struggled to afford sufficient clothing, the narrative takes this deprivation to an extreme, presenting the children as constantly shivering and vulnerable to the elements. The lack of adequate clothing becomes a symbol of how deeply the family is entrenched in poverty. It's not just that the children are cold, they are exposed to the harshness of the world without the protection that clothing should provide. Their vulnerability is a powerful metaphor for how society has failed them, leaving them to fend for themselves in an unfeeling world.
The exaggerated notion of children regularly scavenging for food in public areas reinforces the idea that hunger and deprivation are constant, ever-present conditions in the McCourt household. The image of children rummaging through garbage or begging for scraps is meant to underline how utterly neglected the family is. In many ways, the children's scavenging represents not just hunger, but the broader absence of social safety nets or community support. It suggests a complete breakdown of the basic systems of care and support that one would expect from a civilized society. The exaggeration of this aspect serves to dramatize their hunger, both physical and metaphorical.
Angela's use of ashes from the fireplace to clean the floors adds to the grim and exaggerated depiction of the family's poverty. While it is not uncommon for poor families to reuse materials, McCourt emphasizes the lack of basic cleaning supplies, making it seem like the family is so destitute that they must turn to ash as their only option. This image is one of many that reinforces how the McCourts live not just without material wealth, but without even the most basic tools to maintain a semblance of cleanliness or order. It highlights the sacrifice of dignity, as Angela is forced to use what little is available, stripping the act of cleaning of any comfort or routine.
The image of Frank going barefoot year-round, even in freezing weather, is an exaggeration that serves to further underscore the depth of the McCourt family's poverty. While it's true that many poor children in such circumstances may go without shoes at times, the portrayal of Frank going barefoot all year long in freezing conditions seems extreme. This image emphasizes not only physical deprivation, but also the emotional strain of living in such a state. Going barefoot is an external sign of their poverty, but it also represents their lack of protection from the world. Frank's bare feet become an enduring symbol of his family's vulnerability, open to both physical harm and societal rejection.
The portrayal of the family eating only bread and tea for months on end serves as a stark exaggeration of their food insecurity. While bread and tea would have been cheap staples, the narrative makes it seem as though they never ate anything else, highlighting their extreme deprivation. The monotonous nature of their diet reflects not only a lack of food variety but also a lack of hope or escape from their condition. Eating only bread and tea becomes a symbol of both physical and emotional hunger, reinforcing the family's sense of isolation from the world.
McCourt exaggerates the failure of Angela's family to provide consistent support, despite their somewhat better circumstances. While it is true that Angela's family was not financially well off, McCourt's portrayal often frames them as neglectful and uncaring, even though they could have provided more help. This exaggeration serves to heighten the sense of abandonment and resentment that permeates Angela's feelings toward her family. Their failure to step in and assist the McCourts contributes to the overarching narrative of social neglect and the deep divide between different classes, illustrating how those who have the means to help choose not to. The exaggerated depictions of poverty in Angela's ashes serve to intensify the emotional impact of Frank McCourt's memoir. The extreme images of deprivation and neglect are meant not only to reflect the severity of the family's plight, but to make the reader feel the crushing weight of their suffering. Each exaggeration compounds the other, creating a portrait of a family living in a state of constant crisis, devoid of hope, comfort, and dignity. Through these exaggerated portrayals, McCourt drives home the profound sense of hopelessness and isolation that defined his early life.
To assess the accuracy of McCourt's portrayal, it is essential to contextualize the poverty he describes within the historical and socio-political realities of 1930s to 1940s Ireland. The era was marked by widespread unemployment, inadequate housing, and poor sanitation, exacerbated by the Great Depression and Ireland's ongoing economic struggles. Limerick, in particular, bore the brunt of these hardships, with many families crammed into dilapidated tenements where disease and malnutrition were rampant. Religious institutions, especially the Catholic Church, wielded significant power, often dictating moral and social norms while offering limited charitable relief. In this environment, survival often depended on community resilience and resourcefulness. Families turned to one another for support, pooling resources and relying on informal networks to weather economic uncertainty. While poverty was undeniably harsh, its lived reality often included moments of solidarity, dignity, and even joy, qualities that are notably underrepresented in Angela's ashes. McCourt's portrayal of poverty aligns with many documented aspects of this period: the pervasive dampness, the prevalence of illness, and the stigmatization of the poor by both the church and society. However, his depiction frequently veers into an almost caricatured bleakness. The relentless suffering of the McCourt family, characterized by constant hunger, humiliation, and death, overshadows the nuanced dynamics of working-class Irish life. By focusing so exclusively on despair, McCourt risks reducing poverty to a one-dimensional tragedy. Identifying these discrepancies is vital to ensuring that readers do not conflate his dramatized narrative with a comprehensive representation of Irish poverty. One of the defining features of Angela's Ashes is McCourt's use of humor, wit, and hyperbole to recount his childhood experiences. These narrative techniques create a compelling and emotionally resonant story, but often come at the expense of realism. McCourt's retrospective voice, infused with irony and dark humor, softens the brutality of his circumstances, making his suffering palatable and even entertaining for readers. This approach, while effective in engaging audiences, romanticizes poverty by imbuing it with a sense of resilience and stoicism that may not align with the lived experiences of those who endured similar hardships. For instance, McCourt frequently exaggerates the squalor of his surroundings, describing a world where every room is damp, every encounter is humiliating, and every day is a battle for survival. While these depictions evoke sympathy, they also risk turning poverty into a spectacle. Scenes such as the family's perpetual battles with fleas or the infamous moment when young Frank eats a discarded apple core from a street gutter are crafted to elicit both shock and pity. Yet, the intensity of these depictions strains credibility, leading some critics to question their authenticity. Romanticization is also evident in McCourt's portrayal of his mother, Angela, whose struggles are often overshadowed by her perceived passivity. While Angela undoubtedly faced immense challenges, the memoirs focus on her failures. Her inability to prevent her children's suffering or escape her husband's alcoholism reduces her to a tragic figure, emblematic of helplessness rather than resilience. By framing poverty as an almost insurmountable force, McCourt amplifies its dramatic appeal but risks oversimplifying its complex realities. This romanticization matters because it shapes how readers understand poverty. By presenting hardship as a source of dark humor and poetic reflection, McCourt inadvertently trivializes the systemic forces that perpetuate deprivation. Poverty becomes a narrative device rather than a lived reality, potentially reinforcing stereotypes about the poor as passive victims or figures of pity. While Angela's Ashes is undeniably moving, several aspects of its narrative invite scrutiny for their lack of realism. One such critique revolves around the sheer extremity of the family's suffering. The memoir paints a picture of unrelenting misery, a household plagued by hunger, illness, and death, with little reprieve or hope. While poverty in 1930s to 1940s Limerick was severe, the McCourt's experiences often seem disproportionately grim, bordering on implausible. For example, the memoir describes the family living in a home so damp that the upstairs is rendered uninhabitable, forcing them to sleep on mattresses that are perpetually soaked. While poor housing conditions were common, McCourt's depiction of this relentless dampness reads as hyperbolic, designed to heighten the drama of their plight. Similarly, the memoir's portrayal of Angela's inability to secure consistent aid from the church or local charities diverges from historical accounts, which suggest that many families, while struggling, received some form of relief. Another challenge lies in the depiction of the Catholic Church's role in Irish society. While McCourt rightly criticizes the Church's moral judgment and hypocrisy, his narrative sometimes oversimplifies its influence, presenting clergy members as uniformly cruel or indifferent. This portrayal, while thematically powerful, fails to capture the more complex relationship between the Church and impoverished communities, which often relied on religious institutions for support and advocacy. These exaggerations matter because they risk perpetuating a distorted view of poverty. By portraying deprivation as an almost theatrical tragedy, Angela's Ashes shifts attention away from the structural forces that create and sustain economic inequality. Readers may come away with a skewed understanding of poverty, viewing it as an individual failure rather than a systemic issue. This misrepresentation can have real-world implications, influencing public perceptions of poverty and shaping policy debates in ways that prioritize pity over empowerment. To critique McCourt's portrayal of poverty is not to deny the memoir's literary merits or its emotional impact. Indeed, many defenders of Angela's Ashes argue that its exaggerations and dramatizations serve a deliberate purpose: to undo the systemic failures that allowed such suffering to persist. By amplifying the horrors of poverty, McCourt forces readers to confront its injustices, evoking empathy and outrage that might otherwise be absent. Moreover, as a memoir, Angela's Ashes is inherently subjective, reflecting McCourt's personal recollections and artistic choices rather than a strict adherence to historical fact. Memoirs, by their nature, prioritize emotional truth over objective accuracy, using storytelling techniques to convey the author's perspective. In this context, McCourt's exaggerations can be seen as a means of capturing the emotional intensity of his experiences rather than a literal record of events. Finally, McCourt's use of humor and hyperbole can be interpreted as acts of resistance, transforming his suffering into a source of strength and creativity. By reclaiming his childhood through storytelling, McCourt asserts agency over his narrative, challenging the notion that poverty reduces individuals to helpless victims. While these defenses do not negate the memoir's flaws, they offer a valuable perspective on its literary and cultural significance.